Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning on this Monday morning. It is June 22nd, and just want to greet you this morning as we come together for our daily devotion at 10 a.m. I hope you had a great weekend and were able to celebrate the dads and the father figures in your life on this recent Father's Day. And just a word to all of us, a reminder to all of us that regardless of what our fathers, earthly fathers, history and relationships have been in this life, that our God promises and longs to be our Father and our loving Father. And that's indeed a beautiful reminder and promise for each one of us. Well, we have been walking through the Free Methodist Dignity and Worth of Persons statement so far, and we've made it through the opening statement, the opening kind of couple paragraphs, and now we're going to jump into the section about racism. And so we're just going to jump right in to that and read the first sentence. It says this: racism represents a particularly egregious affront to the dignity and worth of persons, and its presence is manifest in the life, history, and institutions of all nations. It is egregious to the dignity and worth of persons, and its presence is manifest in the life, the history, and the institutions. That's three different things of all nations. Now, I don't know very much about the challenges of racism in other countries, but we are becoming more and more aware of the history and the very current presence of racism in the United States today. Depending on how much you've engaged this and thought about this topic in your own life, this may be something that you're very familiar with, or it may be something that you're just in the process of learning about. For example, last Friday was Juneteenth, and I quizzed all my kids every day throughout the day as I saw them. Do you know what today is? Do you know what holiday it is? Do you know what it's called? Do you know why it's a significant day? Because that's something that I didn't know myself when I was growing up. And so we're all in a process of learning. So some of us certainly know some things, and others of us know more things about the history and the presence of racism in our society. We all are familiar with slavery, and probably somewhat familiar with Jim Crow laws. You may or may not be familiar with the idea of redlining, the identification of certain neighborhoods where it was predominantly African Americans. African Americans were not allowed to purchase homes in other communities, and so certain neighborhoods and portions of town developed as an area of primarily African Americans, and those communities or those sections of town were identified by banks as not being worthy, not being safe enough to provide mortgages for, and so home ownership was significantly impacted, very negatively so. You may be familiar with the Tulsa Race Massacre. That's been in the news a little bit more with the recent rally that was there by President Trump. But this was it's been called the single worst incident of racial violence in the United States history. It happened from May 31st to June 1st, 1921, in an area of Tulsa called Greenwood. It was the Greenwood District. The Greenwood District was the wealthiest black community in the United States. It comprised over 35 square blocks, and it was often referred to as Black Wall Street. And over the course of Memorial Day weekend, white mobs attacked the Greenwood District with airplanes and on the ground, and most of the community was destroyed. At the end of the two-day incident, 10,000 people were left homeless, and millions and millions and millions of dollars, both in personal property and in business property, was completely destroyed. Now, that happened in 1921, and you might think that would be present in history books, particularly in Oklahoma. If you go through Oklahoma history, I grew up in Idaho, and in fourth grade it was Idaho state history, and we learned things all about the state of Idaho. Well, that incident was absent from educational books from 1921 all the way up until 1996, when a bipartisan committee was put together by the state to look at and study the realities of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And finally, in the year 2001, a report came out from this bipartisan group recognizing the violence that happened, actually identifying the city as having conspired with the white mobs, and just moving towards reparations. For example, there's scholarships now that have been made available for descendants of those who had lived in the Greenwood district. It's a very egregious, as our statement says, example of history in the United States, the presence of racism. Well, you might say, well, that was back in the 1920s. We've moved on. In some ways we have, in some ways we haven't. You may be familiar with a teacher named Jane Elliott. She was a third grade teacher in Iowa, and her class had just finished studying Martin Luther King Jr. and came in the following week, and he had been killed. And she was trying to help her students understand how their person of the month could have been killed and why that happened. And so she started this experiment of brown eyes and blue eyes children. This was a community that there was not racial diversity in, and she was struggling to figure out how to help her third graders understand the presence and the realities of racism and discrimination. And so she divided her class for a 2-day experiment. The first day, the blue-eyed students were elevated. They were given a little bit longer recess. They were allowed to go first in line. They were given compliments on their schoolwork. And the brown-eyed students had to be last in line. They couldn't use the drinking fountains. They had time taken away from their recess. They had to wear collars so that they were quickly identified from afar that they were the brown-eyed students, and so it made those interactions easier. At the end of the first day, the students, Jane Elliott talks about that these cooperative, engaging, loving students had turned into these nasty students who were much more likely to fight one another. Their friend, who happened to have different colored eyes, all of a sudden was on the receiving end of fights. But then the next day they switched again, and all of a sudden the brown-eyed students went first in line and had longer recess, and the blue-eyed students had the collars and were the recipients of discrimination. And the results of it were quite stark and quite incredible in a really negative way. That whole experience, she did it for several years in a row. That whole experience is actually on video, and you can watch it on YouTube. There's a documentary of it called Class Divided. Just recently, this weekend, I was reading a story from a young woman who's about the age of one of my older daughters, who grew up in Michigan and was a Girl Scout, went through Girl Scouts her entire life, and she told stories about how they would go camping as part of their Girl Scout experience, and she said that when they went camping in Michigan, it was always a little bit curious, but she never understood why, and never necessarily thought to ask why. But the moms, the troop leaders that went with this girls group camping in Michigan, would take turns sitting watch by the tents and by the cabins where they were. Well, they were in an area that was highly occupied by the Ku Klux Klan, and they were very concerned about the safety of this Girl Scout troop that had African American young women as part of it. And so in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, young women had to be watched over by their moms and their troop leaders so that they would be safe when they were just simply out camping doing Girl Scout things. There's also examples of the school to prison pipeline. That might be something you're familiar with. Just this idea of criminalizing minority youth in our school system. You know, when school shootings became much more common, we would began putting police officers in the schools, and most of those school shootings were done by whites. And what happened, though, is when these police officers began operating in the school system, it was primarily the minorities that were the ones that were targeted by these officers. There's many, many studies done, but one of them is that blacks are 3 times more likely to be suspended than whites in a school. And then there's this stark reality that if an individual is suspended even one time, it doubles their likelihood of dropping out. And so there's just this very concerning trend to seeing what happens to minority students, even from a very, very young age. Think about Jane Elliott's experiment with the brown eyes and blue eyes, of that being lived out. But it isn't just a 2-day experiment that could be ended. It's a day-to-day reality. Even today, I woke up, and you probably did too, to the news that Bubba Wallace, the only African-American driver in the elite level of NASCAR, had a noose put in his garage this weekend, in his NASCAR garage this weekend. This isn't a joke. This isn't some sort of funny thing that people laugh off and say, "Oh, that was cute." That it is not that at all. Many African Americans have been killed by those very nooses, and it is an egregious affront to the dignity of individuals. And so when we think about that, and we think about the statement about the dignity and worth of persons, you might say, well, what am I to do? How am I to respond? And immediately I thought of the story of Cain and Abel. And I want to just read that section of Scripture and just reflect on it for just a couple minutes. So we know the story of Cain and Abel probably quite well. They were children of Adam and Eve. And there is some jealousy that develops in how God interacts and responds to both Cain and Abel's offerings. It says, "Now Abel kept his flocks," Genesis 4, "and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you so angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it.' Now Cain said to his brother Abel, 'Let's go out into the field.' And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?' 'I don't know,' he replied. 'Am I my brother's keeper?' The Lord said, 'What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth.'" When Cain asked the Lord, "Am I my brother's keeper?" he thought it was a rhetorical question, I think. I think he thought, surely that's not my responsibility. My brother is my brother, and I am me. I am not to be worried about or concerned with my brother. But the Lord has very different ideas, doesn't he? We all are called to be our brother's keepers. And that extends beyond our literal brothers and sisters with whom we were raised in our biological or adopted families. We all are called to be each other's brothers and sisters, and we are called to be each other's keepers. And so if we think about the realities, the egregious realities of racism and prejudice in our society today, just the very few things that I ran through, and we could talk for hours, and we could listen for days to the realities and the experiences and the stories of our black and brown brothers and sisters. And the words of the Lord, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground." Those realities spoken to Cain, I believe, are also spoken to us today. We are called to be our brother's keepers. We are called to be concerned with and to value and to respond appropriately with love and compassion and grace to the difficult, egregious persistence of racism today. We indeed are our brother's keepers. That is not a rhetorical question where we say, no, of course not. Everybody's responsible for themselves. We actually are called to be our brother's keepers and to be concerned about each other's neighbors, one together with each other. I'm reminded of Leviticus 19, starting in verse 15. It says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Don't go about spreading slander among your people. Don't do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against any of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And so my prayer is this morning, as we continue to engage in these difficult conversations, as we continue to make ourselves available to learn and to grow and to recognize that what it is that we've been taught maybe isn't the full story, that some people's stories have been left out, that our experience does not necessarily reflect the experiences of our Black and brown brothers and sisters, and to step fully into the responsibility and the calling that Jesus offers to us, that God expects of us, to be one another's keeper. May God bless us and give us strength to speak up and to go forth boldly, that we might treat one another truly as our neighbor and truly as our brothers and sisters. God bless you. Have a great day.